If you really learn how to look at New York City, you'll start to see something incredible. Its buildings, they're not just buildings. They're like a 400-year-old history book written in stone, steel, and glass. And today, we're going to learn how to read it together. So let's start with the big question. How do you even begin to read something so dense? How do you possibly make sense of 4 centuries of constant change, growth, and reinvention all packed onto one tiny island? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. You just look at its buildings. Every single architectural choice, everything from the height of a front step to the shape of a skyscraper, tells a story about the problems, the ambitions, and the tech of its time. Okay, let's start at the very beginning. Our story starts long before the skyscrapers, way back in the 19th century. This is where the city's fundamental DNA was laid out, creating a blueprint that, believe it or not, New York still follows to this day. It all begins with something called the 1811 Commissioner's Plan. This thing was monumental. It sliced Manhattan into this relentless grid of blocks, each one 200 feet deep. Then those blocks were subdivided into these narrow 25-foot-wide lots. And in that process, the planners made one fateful decision. They didn't include any alleys. And yeah, that one decision from over 200 years ago is the direct reason for one of New York's most infamous sights. Those mountains of trash bags piled right on the sidewalk. With no back alleys for collection, everything just had to come out front. Crazy, right? So on those narrow lots, the iconic Brownstone was born. And its most famous feature, the stoop, had a very practical and frankly kind of gross purpose. It was designed to lift the main living floor a whole level above, well, the sea of horse manure that coated the city's streets back then. The other defining feature of these classic row houses was the party wall. It's a thick, shared wall with 0 windows connecting one house to the very next. Now, this was a super efficient way to build, but it had a massive consequence for what it felt like on the inside. Because of that party wall, light and air could only get in from the front and the back. That's it. This single constraint dictated the long, narrow, sort of shotgun-style layout of these early homes, a pattern that would define New York housing for the next 100 years. Okay, so as waves of immigrants began arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that housing model was pushed to its absolute breaking point. The crisis of overcrowding and, frankly, squalor that followed would completely reshape the city. To fit as many people as possible onto those lots, developers came up with a really interesting but flawed solution: the railroad apartment. Basically, rooms just led directly into one another. So if you wanted to get to the kitchen, you might have to walk right through someone's bedroom. Privacy was just not a thing. A lot of these apartments were dark, completely windowless, and really unsanitary. It wasn't until photojournalists like Jacob Riis exposed these horrific conditions in his book, How the Other Half Lives, that the public was truly shocked into action. The city had to do something. And the city's response was the 1901 Tenement House Act. This law was absolutely revolutionary for its time. It mandated that every single room had to have a window. So to make that happen on these narrow lots, architects carved out these little air shafts, which created this distinctive dumbbell floor plan. And for the very first time, it also required indoor plumbing. But you have to understand, even this new requirement was minimal. The law stated there had to be at least 1 toilet in the building for every 20 people. It was an improvement for sure, but that number is just astonishing by today's standards. Now, as the city grew richer and more powerful, a perfect storm of new technology, new laws, and new lifestyles started to push architecture in a completely new direction: straight up. A totally new type of apartment emerged for the growing middle class: the classic 6. This was nothing like the cramped tenement. It was gracious, it had separate rooms, corridors for privacy, even quarters for a live-in maid. And this whole new way of living was made possible by one single game-changing invention: the passenger elevator. So the elevator made tall buildings possible, but it was a new law that gave them their iconic shape. The 1916 zoning law, which was passed because people were worried about tall buildings casting permanent giant shadows, required them to set back as they got higher. The combination of these two forces, the elevator and the setback law, created that famous wedding cake silhouette you see everywhere, perfectly embodied by the Empire State Building. After World War II,
A whole new era dawned. The city became this global hub for corporate power and international finance, and, you guessed it, the skyline transformed once again to reflect that new reality.
You can really tell the story of the modern skyline in about 4 acts. It kicks off with the glass boxes of corporate modernism, then evolves to create public space, it gets a high-tech update, and finally, it morphs into a new kind of tower built not for companies, but for billionaires. The first huge leap was something called the curtain wall, which we first saw on the 1952 Lever House. Suddenly, the building's skin wasn't structural stone anymore. It was a lightweight curtain of glass just hung on an internal steel frame. This is what allowed for that sleek, glassy look that just screamed corporate America. Then, in 1958, came the Seagram building. Instead of building a wedding cake, the architect, Mies van der Rohe, did something brilliant. He built a simple tower and set it way back from the street in a grand public plaza. This solution was so elegant and so successful at letting in light that the city literally wrote it into law, offering developers more floor space if they built public plazas. This one idea completely changed the feel of Midtown. And that brings us to the newest species on the skyline, the supercall. And let me tell you, these things are a totally different beast. They aren't corporate headquarters, they're residences for the world's ultra-wealthy. They're so unbelievably thin that they have to be built out of high-strength concrete. And get this, they need these giant counterweights called mass dampers near the top just to keep them from swaying too much in the wind. It's wild. So when you look at the city, you're not just seeing buildings, you're seeing a physical record of its entire history. You're seeing this constant conversation between problems and solutions, between technology and pure ambition. Ultimately, from the stoop designed to rise above horse manure, all the way to the mass damper that stops a pencil-thin tower from swaying, every single building in New York is an answer to a question that its era was asking. Which, of course, leaves us with one final question. Today, New York is facing a whole new set of challenges, a massive housing affordability crisis, and the very real threat of climate change. So looking at its history of constant adaptation, what story do you think its next generation of buildings will tell?